Ladies and gents, welcome back. The big question of the day is, when is Canada going to move on? The rest of the world has been moving on and has been moving on for some time. But here we are in the endemic stage, and Canada is still under lock and key. We're seeing more restrictions where politicians are hinting at it, just holding back, waiting, seemingly. The public is just wondering when it is that we're going to be going under another lockdown. But the rest of the world has been moving on. We have this from the mainstream media. This is originally posted on the National Post. This is on the MSN website. But why is Canada dragging its feet to get back to normal from COVID? It seems that other places have been moving, or everywhere is moving on, except Canada. On May 2nd, Switzerland and Greece are set to remove all COVID-related travel restrictions. Visitors will no longer be required to show proof of vaccination, proof of recovery, or a recent negative test. The Swiss, who are 70% fully vaccinated, a rate much lower than Canada's approximate 81%. Now, 81% is, I believe, the double vaxxed. There are people with a single and all that are at much higher rates. Removed virtually all domestic pandemic restrictions a month ago, and friends and family are there tell me that life is back to pre-pandemic times. So people have moved on. It's just over. It's done. Move on. Let's just get back to our regular lives. Most European countries have either removed, or are in the final stages of removing pandemic restrictions. The United States, most of Joe Biden's federal vaccine mandates have been gutted by the courts and lie in tatters. Of course, Biden happy to keep those restrictions, but the courts just are not allowing it. Most U.S. states have rolled back pandemic restrictions wholly or in large measure, although much of Asia, with the notable exception of China, we've seen footage from over there and how bad their zero COVID policy is working out just to save face from their dear leader. Life has largely returned to normal in the rest of Asia. That leaves Canada, which continues to be an outlier in terms of severity and longevity of COVID-related rules, restrictions, and mandates. Federal mandates as they relate to the civil service and arriving at the Canadian border remain in place. So, and yeah, this is unbelievable. It's honestly like, if here's a chart of all the countries where a passport is required to fly within the country. You need a vaccine passport to fly within Canada. You can't get on a plane. You can't get on a plane and leave the country. People are saying you can't leave the country. I'm not sure how that works at the land borders. I believe you can bail at the land borders, but you're gonna have a heck of a time getting back in. That's just the way things are here. Federal mandates as they relate to civil service. Yeah, that effectively means that almost 3.7 million unvaccinated Canadians remain prisoners in their own country unless they are willing to undergo pre-entry tests upon return. That would be at the land crossings. You cannot get on a plane. While unvaccinated public servants face a bleak and uncertain future. While several provinces, including Ontario, have lifted most restrictions, Quebec has retained its mask mandate, which is slated to be lifted in the middle of May. Jeez, really? Why? Municipalities such as Ottawa, where most people never saw a rule they didn't like. Yeah, well, we're seeing that. We're threatening to reimpose mask mandates by looking at wastewater signals, which seems to be miraculously came down without anyone doing anything. Unbelievable. However, such alarm bells resulted in some institutions such as Charlton University and the Ottawa Charlton District School Board deciding to retain the mask mandate even though the province had lifted its restrictions. And I add, the risk reward here, like we've seen that there are bad effects, there's adverse effects to forcing people to wear masks, and especially children. And well, what's the risk reward here? It's definitely on the more on the risk side. We're not seeing any benefit at this point, for sure. I mean, that I can say. At the same time, leading experts continue to sound a pessimistic note. A recent paper co-authored by David Fishman, a former member of the Ontario Science Table and well-known advocate of vaccine mandates, who has conflicts of interest probably, I'm assuming based on what I just read, ran a calibrated mathematical model that concluded that vaccine mandates make sense because they reduced the transmission of the virus under some baseline assumptions. A critical driving assumption of the model that the vaccinated are significantly less likely than the unvaccinated to transmit the virus. But a host of recent studies cast serious doubt on this assumption. A January study published in The Lancet, a top peer-reviewed medical journal, itself cited previous research, argues that the impact of vaccination on community transmission of circulating variants of SARS-CoV-2 appeared to be not significantly different from the impact among unvaccinated people. A more recent study from this past month in preprint stage, so not yet peer-reviewed, finds that Omicron infected patients who had received a third vaccine dose had viral loads similar to patients who had 2 doses or who were unvaccinated. If I recall correctly, the booster, the third vaccine dose, was for the Delta variant anyway. So Omicron being, we're in the second or third round of Omicron anyway. This is it sounds ludicrous to me to think that an old vaccine that doesn't even protect against a current virus does any good for you anyway. So what's the point here? In other words, the key assumption that drives the result of Fishman's study appears increasingly contradicted by real-world empirical studies. Without this assumption, the model's results and its conclusions in favor of vaccine mandates totally fall apart. Yet the paper excited the commencing class because it appeared to lend scientific support for continuing their predetermined conclusions. Vaccine mandates in sensible places. Public policy is informed by data-based analysis, which crushes actual real-world numbers and runs counterfactual experiments to come up with policy recommendations. Models based on the theory alone are useful in fixing our institutions about causal mechanisms, but by themselves cannot be meaningful guidelines for policy unless they are combined with the real-world data that backs up their theoretical assumptions. This is much like the situation in economics, which, depending on the assumptions that you make, theoretical models can prove just about anything you want them to. To be a useful guide for policymakers, theories must be backed up with solid real-world empirical evidence. I have to agree with that wholeheartedly. I haven't heard any sensible economic theories coming out of politicians in a long time. Not in a long time. Deficit spending, how's that been working out? How has that been working out? While gathering evidence undercuts the case for vaccine mandates, what about mask mandates? Recall that Quebec, while lifting the vaccine mandates like Ontario, chose to retain the mask mandate. Why? Oh, good Lord. If there was any benefit, it doesn't show up in the data. The hospital rate, the word gets me every time. The hospitalization rate per 100,000 of population is 28 in Quebec and only 12 in Ontario. 28 people in 100,000 people. Wow, big risk. There are a lot of other differences between the two provinces, But this staggering difference between hospitalization rate certainly does not provide compelling evidence in favor of Quebec's more stringent rules having made a difference. The truth is that unlike most places in the world, many Canadians, both policymakers and the public, seem unwilling to move on from the pandemic and return to life as usual. Now, there are some people in the public that I see on Twitter, these weird, like crazy outliers that are just insane. There are a few people that you see on the streets that have masks on still. I don't know why if they agree with this in particular, but I know that every single person I know is happy to move on with this. Happy to move on. They don't see any issue. They're not afraid, and they're looking at government saying, "What a bunch of wackos. Let's get out of here. Let's get on with this." They did seem unwilling to move on from the pandemic, and not Canadians and policymakers. No, just policymakers are unwilling to move on and return to life as usual. In a country known for cultural compliance, which you're starting to see a lot less of. That's a culture of compliance. I want to argue this one. We have a culture of compliance, but it's more of a culture of, okay, I don't want to argue about it. I'll tell you that I'm going to do it, and then I'm just not going to do it. That's kind of the way, that's more of the compliance culture we have here. Maybe I'm speaking for the West Coast. Maybe I am. Let me know in the comments down below if that's how you feel about it at all. There's been a serious lack of leadership, especially in the level of federal government, in signaling in no uncertain terms that we are now in the last lap of the pandemic. Instead, ambiguous messaging and keeping federal vaccine mandates in force for the indefinite future only serve to keep the populace in a state of fear and anxiety, beyond providing a rationale for unending government control by the rule of mandate. What other purpose is served? Countries spanning the political spectrum from left to right are now firmly in the end game. While here in Canada, we're still fussing about the sixth wave, reading water signals like tea leaves, wastewater signals like tea leaves, and wondering whether life will ever return to normal. Our friends around the world are scratching their heads and asking, what is so special about Canada, eh? What is so special about Canada, eh? Why is it that we're more susceptible to a virus? I don't believe that we are more susceptible than the rest of the world to a particular virus. And I don't think behaving like China is a good move forward. We all see what's going on in China. Nobody here agrees with that. Let's move on. It's time to lift those restrictions. It's been way too long. Anyways, that's all I got for you on this one. Stay tuned for the next video. We'll see you in the next one. Keep on trucking.